Welcome back. The time is 7 minutes past 8, and we're going to be kickstarting the show with a look into the war on against Iran by the U.S. and Israel. Fresh tensions are simmering between Tehran and Washington. This is after Iran's latest peace proposal reportedly included demands for war reparations, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from areas near Iran, and the lifting of sanctions. The proposal comes amid a very, very fragile ceasefire and renewed warnings from US President Donald Trump that military strikes could resume if talks collapse. A lot of analysts have been touching on this issue, and they've been saying that the demands from Iran could either open the door to negotiations or push both sides closer to another dangerous escalation. And we're going to be unpacking that. And joining us now for more insight is a very, very good friend of the show and Press TV correspondent here in South Africa, Hassen Seria. Brother Hassen, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Good morning.
Thanks. Good morning to you, Salalu. Always good being here.
No, pleasure's all ours. And I think we'll jump right into it. This was a moment in the last couple of weeks where we thought there might be a breakthrough between Iran and the United States of America, but it always feels like there's a hindrance. There's always something blocking what could see ultimate end to this war and the cessation of hostilities between the two countries. From your perspective, if you can just encapsulate this moment for us in the greater scheme of the war on Iran by the US and Iran, how would you wrap it all up for us?
I think if I look at the situation, it appears that both sides are trying to keep the status quo. They want to not engage in any sort of a battle while still portraying each of the sides, both the United States as well as Iran, as having been the victors of the actual fighting that we witnessed during the month of March into early April. That is my reading of the situation. And I think when we discussed, in fact, that ceasefire, when it came into effect, that it was very unnatural the way in which it happened, that the cessation was just announced by Pakistan, and that was supposed to be the halt in the hostilities. And it has held for some period of time. But if we look at that 15-point plan that was presented, the demands that, or rather the 10-point plan that was presented, we've looked at the counter plan that the United States has put forward, what Iran, again, as you've mentioned, is demanding. They remain poles apart. The one is saying we have a right to nuclear enrichment. The other one is saying you will not have any form of nuclear enrichment. You will also not have the ability to develop a bomb, because that is, of course, their claim. The one is saying we must release or lift all of the sanctions. The other side is saying that there will be no concessions. So each of the parties here are trying to portray themselves as having that leverage to make these major demands. At this point in time, if we look at this from a negotiating perspective, because in terms of negotiations, there is a give and take. You're going to go in with a certain set of demands. You're going to come out with some sort of concessions from either side. So when we look at each of the sides, they're still making maximalist demands. This is from the Iranian side as well, because, of course, from the Iranian perspective, they were the victors of the battle. They ensured that the Americans were not able to stage a coup in Iran. They got the major backing of the people of Iran, who came out onto the streets and continue to come out onto the streets. Militarily, they were able to continue striking American and the American allies' targets within the region. Right up until that ceasefire point. So, from Iran's perspective, they were the victors. They managed to thwart any of those stated goals of the United States and Israel. From the American side, we know that there's a lot of posturing, because the reality is that the American bases in the region have been heavily affected. And we are still seeing now more information coming out in terms of the type of operations the Iranians carried out, as well as the extent of those operations, the extent of the Iranian intelligence as well, in terms of real-time movements of American troops who, for example, fled to civilian hotels, for example, and that the Iranians were still able to track down the Americans and strike them within those locations. So when we look at the situation, I think we're still poles apart. Um, if I were to just on the basis of what is happening at the moment, is that there clearly isn't necessarily an appetite for war, but we still see a lot of this
Mm,
posturing from the United States. And it's not just posturing, there's actual build-up and developments in terms of military hardware coming into the region and strategizing that is happening. Naturally, we can assume and understand from the statements of the Iranians that this is also what's happening on their side. But the question is, how will all of this end? Will it sort of just fizzle out and we will all go back to life as normal? I think the point that prevents that, however, is the fact that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz has changed, that we now have this major choke point that has not returned to normal. That if we look at the
mm,
situation, it is not even that we can say maybe there's been a 5% increase in the amount of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. So maybe we're getting to that point where things will return to normal. And I think that is such a major sticking point, because this doesn't only relate to the United States. This relates to the regional countries within the Persian Gulf. These are the Arab states. And then, of course, the world feels the impact, as we in ourselves in South Africa know as well. We are seeing that in the knock-on effect with fuel prices, and of course how that will impact on the cost of living here. So that is the
mm.
situation, and I think that is the resolution, that if there is something or some move towards a resolution, that is going to become the key aspect. That if that can be resolved, we may then see things starting to calm down.
Mm. I think one thing that was interesting for me, as we were, building up to the talks, is Pakistan emerging as, a major, shall we say, mediator between the two warring parties here. Do you think maybe another country would have maybe done justice to that responsibility? Maybe Pakistan was not as strong and as forthcoming in making sure that both the United States of America and Iran do come to a table and there's an ultimate peace deal that is signed and that is agreed upon two parties. I mean, if you look at Pakistan's relationship with the United States of America, they honestly usually in a lot of cases are a proxy of the US, and it almost felt like they would bend to whatever demands that the United States was making in these negotiations. Is it a missed opportunity, the fact that there wasn't a really strong forthcoming chief negotiator, mediator between these two parties?
No, I somehow think that Pakistan was the best placed country for these mediation, the mediation of these talks. I think we've got to just look a bit broader. Look at this as the big picture here. The big picture is that this is actually a battle between China and the United States. This is a battle that has been happening within West Asia, the Arab and Islamic countries, the countries that are key producers of oil and resources, mineral resources, for the better part of at least the past decade to 15 years. So this is the battle that is at play here. It is between the United States and China. China, of course, plays a very smart game in that China doesn't actively get involved in these conflicts. We've seen
Mm,
in China's statements, they are very neutral sort of statements. We call for a cessation of hostilities, that sort of very a standard diplomatic language. However, there's been situations where China has come to the fore. For example, in terms of Syria, when we saw the major deterioration in Syria, China there did make a statement that was slightly stronger. When America and Israel struck Iran, looking both in June of last year and in February of this year, China came out and they actively voiced support for Iran's right to defense. They did not come out with a very generic statement of calling for hostilities. So China here at this point. So this is all the strategic importance of China. We saw, for example, with the Omani talks, as much progress that had been made in those talks, there's a limitation for Oman because Oman sees itself as the Switzerland of the Middle East, that it
mm,
is a country that will be a friend of all, a foe of none. It will not actively get involved on any side. And this is sort of the limitation in terms of the type of leverage that they may have. So Pakistan here, as you mentioned, an important ally of the United States in many instances, Even if we look at, for example, as far as the ouster of Imran Khan, the leader of Pakistan, the American role that came into play there as well. However, more than the links with the United States, Pakistan has key links with China. And these links extend to the military, these are strategic links, these are geopolitical links as well. So, my contention was always that when these talks happened, when Pakistan made that announcement, it was first and foremost with the blessing of the Chinese. Uh, Potentially because the Chinese had actually pushed for some sort of a move towards getting the United States to the negotiating table, and that anything that happens is with the backing of the Chinese. So there's an important element here to the role that Pakistan is playing. Over and beyond this, I think the important thing is to keep in mind, for example, now information has come to the fore that Pakistan even allowed for Iran to park some of its jets, for example, in Pakistani hangars or at their bases during the war itself. So when we look at this situation, as well as Pakistan's links both to Iran as a neighborly country as well as a brotherly country, and we can see this in the type of engagements when the Iranians, for example, come to Pakistan or the Pakistanis visit Iran, the type of embraces that they give each other, the chemistry that is shared between these nations as well, the fact that they share those borders, that there's been long-term cooperation in terms of even now trade and sort of circumventing the American blockade, that there is that strong ties. But Pakistan is also well placed because of its extensive relations and even the military relations with Saudi Arabia. So Pakistan emerges here as a strong power. There are, of course, other important powers, and this is how Pakistan very smartly is leveraging its relations and its diplomatic ties with all of these maybe contesting parties, because between Iran and Saudi Arabia, there's a contestation, between China and the United States, there's a contestation, but this then elevates Pakistan's position. And I think we've seen that even though there's not been a second round of talks, what the Pakistanis have managed to do is to continue engagements, whether with the Americans only, whether with the Iranians only, whether with the Chinese also in the background. Pakistan has managed to maintain that. So Pakistan, I think, remains well placed as the party that should be pushing for or playing this role of the negotiator sort of in this conflict.
I want us to take a quick break. When we come back, I want us to chat briefly on what kind of conversations is Israel possibly having with the United States of America. What would they want to see going forward? That's number one. And I think number two, what does the future hold? Are we going to see a stalemate, a position where you have a Cold War kind of style, relationship between the US and Iran? And what could it mean for broader geopolitics and for countries like South Africa? And I think those are very, very important kind of points to touch on, and we'll do that after the short break.
It's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying, or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
Qurbani is an act of worship, a sacrifice made for the sake of Allah. But for some families, it may be the only time all year they are able to have meat. A simple meal, shared, remembered, longed for. This Eid, your Qurbani can reach them. From just 1,300 Rand, you can provide Qurbani meat to families in over 30 countries. Make your Qurbani count for them. Give Qurbani, give love with Islamic Relief.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042 203 1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Africa. Give the gift of clean water with Africa Muslims Agency. With every water well or borehole you donate, your drop becomes a river, reconnecting communities to nourishment, education, dignity and empowerment. Sponsor a water well for 17,000 Rand in Africa or a borehole for 65,000 Rand in Afghanistan or Africa. Quench the thirst. Reconnect the soul with Africa Muslims Agency.
Are you banking with convenience, transparency, and flexibility? With Al Barakah Bank's transactional banking account, you can enjoy convenient everyday banking designed around your needs. Benefit from zero fees on point-of-sale transactions and manage your banking easily through Al Barakah's secure mobile banking app and internet banking platform. From everyday payments to managing your personal or business banking, Al Barakah makes banking simple, transparent, and convenient. Visit albarakah.co.za to learn more. Al Barakah, your partner bank. Al Barakah Bank Limited is an authorized financial services and credit provider.
Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidiri. The time is 24 minutes past 8 Central African time, and we're having a really, really engaging and I think wonderful conversation with Press TV correspondent here in South Africa, Hassen Seria. And we are looking at the US-Israeli war on Iran and why there seems to be no progress when it comes to peace talks and the cessation of hostilities between the two countries. And Brother Hassan, thank you so much for staying with us. Before we went into that short break, I wanted to chat briefly about the Israeli element here and what kind of conversations they're potentially having with the United States of America. Could they possibly be another stumbling block to whether or not there is ultimate ceasefire and an end to this war?
Well, that I think remains the serious concern, and what we've seen from the Israelis throughout this 3-year period, as it were now, since the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, is that there's been an appetite from the Israelis, not only to host what they call mowing the lawn as such, as in bringing the resistance movements down to a level where they don't pose an immediate or serious threat for a period of time before the Israelis again carry out their aggression and their continued genocide against these movements and groups, but that the Israelis have seemed to push for an all-out conflict, a all or nothing sort of approach. And that is, for example, what we saw in Gaza, what they've been trying to achieve in Lebanon as well, and even in the West Bank, that they've been trying to push for that. And of course, they believed already from last year, when they struck Iran for the first time, when we saw the situation deteriorate in January in Iran as well, with those protests that occurred there that we know artificially managed, and during this war, that they thought this was going to be that moment, that they'd be able to go all out against Iran and they'd be able to achieve their goals of completely eliminating the Islamic Republic, as it were. Of course, things are changing on the battlefield, and this is what we've witnessed, for example, in Lebanon, where the resistance from Hezbollah has been far more than what people had expected, what the Israelis and the Americans had read the situation as. And in addition to that, the Islamic resistance in Lebanon has proved that they've got the capability to adapt in the moment, as well as we've seen, for example, with the introduction of these fiber optic sort of linked FPV drones as well, and the extent of the impact that they've had on the Zionist forces there, where even commanders and so on, we are now seeing being targeted and assassinated by the resistance. So this changes the game, and this, of course, asks the question whether the Israelis will, at this point, recalibrate, whether they will ask themselves the question of whether this is the right time. They, however, do seem to have the strong belief, active sort of engagement of the Americans on the battlefield, that they will be able to bring about that sort of change in terms of the way the West Asian region looks. But the Americans aren't showing that sort of appetite at this point in time, despite all of the posturing. I think the other element to all of this is, what role does China bring in? And the fact that we saw now the visit by the American president, by the American leadership to China, it was a high level delegation that had gone there, and not just the president, but in terms of the entourage, who else was with him there, what they were seeking from China in those talks. We see then that followed up by the current visit by the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who is an ally of China. Now, as far as, if I were to look at this from a diplomatic perspective, even from just a logical perspective, it was a bad move for the United States to have visited China at this point in time. I know these talks were planned already prior to the war on Iran and so on, but it is actually the United States here, Donald Trump, visiting China with a bloody nose. He's already been battered by Iran here, which is the frontier as far as China is concerned. Is a key ally of China, part of the SCO, part of BRICS. So he's going to China now with a bloody nose, and he's trying to ask China, how can we resolve this mess that I've created? So you go to your chief foe to ask this. And as we've seen from the posture of the Chinese, I mean, the Chinese sat, they listened, but they gave no commitments, because as far as the Chinese is concerned, you, my foe, you got yourself into this situation. Why should I be the one, giving you a hand to pull you out of the pit at this point in time? So the Chinese have used that to their advantage. And the question now is, how does the Americans then assess the Chinese posture, assess what came out of those engagements with the Chinese, and then try to now apply some sort of pressure on Israel, or say, look, we've got to relook the situation. This is not something that is going to be achieved militarily. We will have to recalibrate and reconsider how we do things. And I think that is what we're going to have to look at. Will the Americans be able to bring that pressure to bear on the Israelis in order to change the situation? Or are they going to just allow the Israelis to continue with their hostilities and their aggression, both in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, as well as in Lebanon? And of course, the important thing from the Iranians now, they've again reiterated both Lebanon and Gaza as key areas where they want to see respect of the ceasefire as well. So I think these are all of the considerations that will determine the way forward as far as this particular point is concerned, and whether we are going to see an escalation, whether Israel is going to sort of get its way or not. I think that is ultimately it. At this point in time, it is a bit hard to sort of predict, because the Americans seem to be on one page. The Americans are saying another thing, of course, as we saw again with Donald Trump giving that major warning about Tuesday being the day that he's going to strike and so on. And now even the countries within the Arab region, Qatar and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, for example, coming out and saying, but we didn't even know about any attack, even though Trump referenced them and said that it is because of their request that he halted the strike on Iran, or the resumption of the strikes against Iran. So if we look at the situation, I think it's an interesting one. It is one that the Chinese visit will have a major bearing on how the Americans forge ahead. But where the Israelis stand and what the Israelis might do, I think that a question mark still remains over that. because the Israelis have proved that when they believe a certain thing, and Benjamin Netanyahu here as well, that they will go all out for that because they believe they are the stronger power.
There's another concern where, a lot of people feel we could have an almost Cold War aesthetic kind of reality going forward where, you have extreme tensions and there are extreme hostilities between the two entities, but there isn't direct conflict. Instead, they are engaging in indirect kind of, proxy wars or competing in other ways. Is that a reality where this could be the state of affairs for the world going forward, where it's that Cold War style kind of reality and it remains like that? Is that a possibility, or are we still having an opportunity and a chance for diplomacy to prevail here?
Look, I think the channels are still open. We see that there are attempts by Pakistan and so on. We see some other countries also hoping that they could emerge as the brokers for some sort of talks or even an understanding between the Americans and the Iranians. So the channels are still open. The fact that the Iranians and the Americans are so far apart in terms of the demands they are making, yes, that is a reality, but it at least there's no sort of complete cutoff of the channels of engagement as yet. So that is a good thing. I think that also shows that hopefully there is the potential for a new round of talks of some sort whenever that may come. But there is a possibility that the situation could also just, as you say, it could just calm down. As we've seen for a number of weeks now, there are no hostilities. There might be skirmishes here or there, so that each of the parties can sort of portray or project power. The question, I think, from the American side is that the Americans will need to ask the question, what is their future role within West Asia? It seems that from a number of the Arab countries, they are starting to realize that maybe the situation now is that the Americans are not guarantors of our protection, that despite having had the bases there, the Americans did not protect us first. Their focus was on Israel. And apart from that, they couldn't even protect their own bases, as we've seen. We saw now, for example, Saudi Arabia is proposing a military protection pact with Iran. So if we look at this, it almost indicates that we're moving into a point now where countries are starting to ask themselves, how can we reap the spoils of war here? So Saudi Arabia is considering, it is in BRICS with Iran. It does have a good relations with Iran based on the China deal. Despite whatever differences the two countries have, they have kept those channels open. They've even pledged to work together on certain oil fields as well. So there is that sort of cooperation. So when Saudi Arabia is proposing taking this into the military arena, it is now actually re-looking at its role not only as a key sort of player within West Asia, but it is saying that you may be our biggest foe within the region or our biggest rival, but we've got to see a recalibration. And if we look at West Asia, the history of West Asia, we had certain countries that were those sort of stabilizing factors. We had Saudi Arabia, we had Syria, we had Egypt. Of course, after 2011 and what was characterized as the Arab Spring, Syria was removed, Egypt was removed in terms of the weight that they played within the region. So this is probably the recalibration of the weights within the region, and between these countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran here, for example, we can see that recalibration and how they play the role of being those major weights within the region. Because one thing that is accepted quite broadly internationally is that Iran is emerging here as a power. It was able to confront the United States as well as Israel. But I think the sticking point here, in terms of this Cold War issue that you raise, is the Strait of Hormuz. The reality is that the Strait of Hormuz cannot stay as it is. So the Americans are saying they're implementing a blockade. Iran has found ways to circumvent that through its understandings with Pakistan and so on. It has used some sort of military pressure in terms of striking certain targets or seizing certain vessels that are trying to pass through the strait. The Americans had to cancel their Operation Freedom within less than 24 hours. So when we look at the situation, the Americans, however, remain at the gates of the Strait of Hormuz, and they are still imposing some sort of a sense of presence there. And this is an ominous presence that we've seen. The amount of countries, despite the offering of protection and that from the Americans, that they don't want to use the strait. On the flip side of that, Iran is forging ahead formally with introducing this Persian Gulf Coordination Council, that it is saying that this is the sort of the measures that must be respected, that ships must do their applications, they must do their payments and all of that. But the reality for Iran is that even despite this mechanism being introduced, despite the talks with, for example, the Arab countries, despite its understandings with Oman, is that hasn't been buy-in to this plan. International buy-in, we'd say, is there because the amount of traffic that's moving has moved from 5% to maybe 15% to 20% to 30%, but that is not the case. So as far as Iran's plan of having this mechanism of control between itself and Oman of the Strait of Hormuz, there hasn't been international buy-in. So this brings the entire world into the picture. The question now is, how long will the world be willing to sit with the situation as it is before the situation becomes dire, and then they say, you know what, we've got to, maybe not $2 million, but we're going to pay $1 million. And that is the negotiation, and then we see a resumption of the Strait of Hormuz operating at the levels that it was, and the global economy sort of coming back to the norm. And then that is just because of the passage of time that we as the global community will be forced into coming to some sort of an understanding. But the Strait of Hormuz at this point in time appears to be the major leverage that is being held. And the question here is whether international countries are going to, at some point, sort of give in and say that we are now willing to pay these tariffs, that we accept and concede that Iran and Oman has right here, that they can control the traffic through there, or, sitting back. But sitting back is not an option because it impacts on the global economy, it impacts on access to important resources, your fertilizers, your oil, your helium, all of these things that are coming from that region. So the status quo is not something that can continue. I think that is more likely what we're looking at. Of course, throughout this, the reality of a resumption of hostilities remains the situation, and that is the nature of ceasefires. Any small trigger, any unrelated sort of event as well, can impact on the situation on the ground. But I think that is the uncertainty that all sort of prevails over the situation at this point in time.
No, most definitely, Brother Hassen Seria. Always a pleasure chatting to you and having you unpack, I think, what's very, very pivotal moment in global history. Really appreciate your time and hope we chat again soon.
Thank you, Salalo.
There we go. Press TV correspondent here in South Africa, Hassen Seria, and I think he always does it so well, unpacking all of the different elements of the US-Israeli war on Iran, the current status quo, and ultimately looking at his crystal ball on what could be the next outcome. And yeah, it's very concerning indeed if things do remain this way and that there isn't full cessation of hostilities between the US and Iran specifically, and a strong negotiator doesn't come out of this. The world's economy can't handle it. I think as South Africans can feel it as much as everyone else. And yeah, there needs to be a change of some sort. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, News and Views will continue and we'll be looking at the current status quo here in South Africa. KZN refugees saying they face hunger, fear, and forced evictions. This is amid anti-illegal immigrant protests that have rocked that part of South Africa. So more on that after this.